Ask a lot of people and they'll probably tell you that season 1 of The Flash is probably one of, if not the best, season of the entire show. It's got a lot of great character moments, cool action and special effects, and the villain's actually trying to work out a simple and intelligent scheme this time around.
Is he though?
Well, actually no, he's not. Even just thinking about it for less than a second, it's pretty apparent that Eobard Thawne came up with possibly the dumbest scheme in the entire history of The Flash all the way back in season 1. Just in case you forgot what all his plan is, let's do a quick recap. Because of his fluctuating connection to the negative speed force, Thawne needed to train Barry to get as fast as possible before using him and a properly functioning particle accelerator to open a wormhole, allowing Thawne to go back to his time in the far-flung future of Who Cares because that timeline's been long gone since the start of season 2. This is all fine and dandy until you remember that, in order to get Barry on board with this plan in the first place, Thawne mentioned that Barry could use the process to travel back in time to the day his mom was murdered and save her, effectively changing history back to the way it was in the original timeline.
Create a stable wormhole through which I could return home. Why would I ever do that? Because you can go back and save your mother.
This would mean a whole bunch of changes, like Barry growing up with both of his parents, massively changing the relationships he developed over the course of the first season, and still becoming the Flash anyway, just a few years later in the far-flung future of 2020, when he's more emotionally mature and competent, I guess.
The you I know from the future, he's not this stupid.
Why is that a problem, you may ask? Well, because the whole thing makes no sense. I mean, we already know thanks to season 3 that Barry saving his mom creates a timeline where Barry doesn't become the Flash. So assuming there's a version of Thawne native to this timeline somewhere, he probably wouldn't be a speedster, since there's no Barry running around to mess with. And I have a hard time believing this guy would just willingly go back to being some nerd doing whatever he was doing before he got his powers in the future. But even on top of that, if the plan works and Barry does end up changing the past, then logically the future that Thawne's so desperate to get back to wouldn't exist anymore, and he would have just erased himself anyway. The more you think about it, Thawne's plan that season gets dumber and dumber, especially for somebody who's managed to map out the timeline and brags about being able to manipulate it for his benefit.
Because I am the only speedster that knows how to manipulate the timeline to get what I want.
But come on, do you really think Thawne's gonna leave all that stuff up to chance? There has to be a better way to interpret it. Like, what about the idea that Thawne's trying to create a split timeline, giving both he and Barry what they want in one swoop? We already knew even back at the start of season 1 that alternate timelines were a thing, with this idea later reconfirmed during a conversation between Barry and Eobard in the season 1 finale Fast Enough. At one point, Barry mentioned that Thawne hates him in the future, but Thawne quickly corrects him saying they're enemies in a future.
Because I hate you. Not you now. You years from now.
In the future.
In a future, yes.
And like it or not, but this idea was expanded on in a big way as the series went on, with almost every big-name speedster eventually running through time and changing something or other. Killing Nora Allen, pre- and post-Flashpoint, getting the speed equation and fixing this doodad, this stupid time hack, Nora Point, sending whatever these guys were back in time, the list goes on and on in this show. Therefore, maybe Thawne's big brain idea in this case was that Barry saving his mom would simply split the timeline, letting Thawne go back to the timeline he and his version of Barry originally came from, while current Barry gets to live out his life with his family and doing whatever he feels like doing, like stalking Iris or whatever. This kind of makes sense until you remember a couple time travel rules the show brings up in the later seasons that kind of debunks the whole thing. First things first, it's already been established since season 3 that any changes to the timeline are more or less permanent, and regardless of how careful a speedster is, they can't just make a bunch of changes and go back and forth between whatever timelines they want at any point.
So whenever you go back in time, it breaks. Now,
Real, I mean,
you can reset the timeline. You can try to fix it. But no matter how hard you try, it's never going to be exactly how it was.
This isn't necessarily a big deal, since season 5 showed us that intelligent speedsters can change things throughout time and still end up with a timeline that's more or less the same as before they started changing things around, but the show has made it pretty clear multiple times that a split timeline like this theory is literally impossible anyway. Instead, given everything we've seen in the show alone, the writers seem like they've gone for the singular timeline approach, meaning that time in this universe is more like a single shot rather than a branching tree. Any changes at one point don't create a new and separate timeline, but rather change things from that point in the original timeline and influence whatever would have happened afterwards. It's like when Barry mentioned that Flashpoint didn't exist anymore in the season 3 episode Untouchable.
We vibe Flashpoint.
Flashpoint doesn't exist anymore.
If the Arrowverse timeline did exist on a branching path like we usually see in other time travel movies and TV shows, then that timeline would still exist, just on a separate branch, meaning Cisco could have vibed it without having to check in on a separate random universe where Flashpoint was still a thing. Regardless of how we interpret the timeline or any time travel rules though, you'd think any potential risk to getting erased would be a big concern for the guy who, again, maps the timeline on a regular basis. Granted, I'm sure Thawne's smart enough to avoid wiping himself out, but at the same time, I'm also sure he'd want to avoid any errors that could get him erased as best he could. Either way, I'm not completely sold on this one, and to be honest, there's better options out there anyway. Like for instance, these guys. Remember, Thawne's been studying the Speed Force for years, so even if he didn't already have hands-on experience with the time wraiths, even though the Season 2 episode flashback makes it pretty clear he does.
The time wraith. That's what we call them. Time wraiths. Scary.
He'd at least know that the Speed Force doesn't like speedsters messing around with time, and would be aware that it has no problem course correcting in some way or another. Either way, Thawne's plan to get back to the future makes way more sense if we assume that the whole thing was just him tricking a young, inexperienced speedster the entire time. Promising Barry something he couldn't have thanks to the wrath of the Speed Force would both help Thawne get back to his future and get rid of his biggest enemy at the same time, and without any risk of him getting erased too. So yeah, it seems like a win-win for him, right? Couple of problems though. Besides the fact that removing one of the biggest heroes of the present day from history would still drastically change the future and potentially erase Thawne, there's also the issue that we never saw a time wraith coming after Barry in the Flashpoint timeline either. I always wondered why one of these things never came after him in the few months he spent in there, considering that statement from Thawne himself in Season 2, and the issues with changing a fixed point in time, like Harry mentioned in the episode The Reverse Flash Returns.
In our timeline, Barry's mother's already dead and her death is a fixed point and nothing can change that.
However, like I mentioned earlier, we also know from later seasons that it's possible to change a timeline and not see any repercussions from it if you do things in a very specific way. So it's possible that Barry just lucked out and managed to make a big change without pissing off the Speed Force. Again though, it's still an option that comes with a lot of risks to his own existence, and there's no guarantee that Barry wouldn't do something stupid and mess up the whole plan in the first place, so I still can't see this one being a solid reasoning for his plan either. However, there is one decent possibility that we haven't considered yet, and after thinking about it, it actually checks off a bunch of the different boxes Thawne would have to consider before recommending Barry's guilt trip through time, and that would be the negative Speed Force. Not only did Thawne himself confirm that the negative Speed Force is immune to any and all timeline changes in the Season 5 finale Legacy,
Negative Speed Force. She has to go there. It's the only place immune to timeline changes.
but we also know from a few different episodes that it takes time for any major changes in the timeline to solidify. Remember how Barry didn't immediately lose all of his memories when he created Flashpoint? Or how Nora didn't immediately disintegrate after Team Flash destroyed Cicada's dagger? The same thing would apply if Barry went through with saving his mom in the Season 1 finale, so Thawne would have to move pretty quickly after getting back home in order to bunker himself down in the negative Speed Force and ride out whatever changes would be coming his way. And just in case you're wondering how he would even get in there in the first place with his powers all out of whack, don't forget two major things. First, Thawne's a genius who fully studied and understands the Speed Force better than almost anyone in the Arrowverse so far, to the point where he was able to give himself superpowers and even build his own Speed Force. Right away, I have no problem believing that Thawne has some piece of equipment in his lab, or some other scheme or whatever that could have saved him in the end once he got back to the future. But second, he was never completely separated from his powers anyway. I mean, we do see him running around fighting Team Flash plenty of times in Season 1. He may not have had enough juice to run all the way through time, but it is possible that Thawne could have managed his way into the negative Speed Force once he got back home. Either way, Thawne planning on hiding out in the negative Speed Force after getting back to the future is the theory that makes the most sense to me. It's really the only option where he could get Barry to help send him home without any issues or any risk of getting erased later, and if everything went well, somebody else like Wally probably would have been the Flash after Barry's escapades in the past, so it's almost like a 2-for-1.
I always win. Flash.
And that's why we love to hate you. But anyways guys, that's my take on how Thawne's plan to get back to the future in Season 1 of The Flash actually made sense the entire time. If you guys agreed with anything I said in this video, or if you have your own thoughts you want to throw out there, then go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I will see you all next time. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, then go ahead and click that like button, and if you're new, maybe consider clicking that subscribe button too. I've also got links to my Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, and Patreon in the description. You should probably check those out too. And if you want to see more of my content, then you can click the link to my last video. It's right there in the middle of your screen. Alright, and I will see you all next time.